unity, one God, one life, one way, one reality. And the people of the world need to start seeking that name, so that they can start realizing what they're missing.
And by the way, part of the name, is not just the name, but it's all these things that are attached to the name.
Exactly.
It's like, say, I know Hiram, and so when somebody comes up and says, "You know Hiram Vasquez?" "Oh yeah, I know Hiram." And all of a sudden, kind of in my mind, I get a facial recognition of who that is.
Mm-hmm.
They could just say Hiram, and I say, "Wait a minute, which Hiram are you talking about?" Maybe there's more than one Hiram. But then we get more specific, and then I say, "Okay, I know Hiram," and all of a sudden, I remember Hiram's mannerisms. I know how he acts. And that's really you. It's not your name per se, but that's really you.
Mm-hmm.
So the Eternal One, right, has certain actions that we attribute to that name. In other words, He's loving, right? He is kind. Mm-hmm. He is merciful. Yes, He is just, and He's righteous. That we assign to that name. Mm-hmm. So when we start thinking about the name, all that becomes just attached to Him.
Right, but Solomon was trying to convey a message.
Yes.
And that's the interesting point to me, is that people tend to not see the message in his words. And he's speaking about the temple. There's only one temple.
Exactly.
There's not many, like people think.
He's talking about the temple that he dedicated in Mount Moriah, right, in Jerusalem. But the interesting part, I think, that he also says that God would hear him in heaven. Right? He prays toward the temple, but God would hear him in heaven, and that God would answer his prayer. But the important part is so that he would learn to fear that name, just as Israel fears.
Exactly.
Okay? So all of a sudden, this thing about, there's this prohibition against idolatry, but all of a sudden it turns around to a positive of worshiping, but not just worshiping any God, but worshiping the right God. Right? So Israel, has maintained this idea of a strict monotheistic idea, and has declared to us through that name, right, these things about God that we can know, and that we can rest assured that these are identified with that God. And all of a sudden now we can worship that God. Why? Because now we begin to know that God. He's not only, if you look at it another way, here is this stranger, maybe he's came from a far land that we're worshiping other gods.
Right.
And he's been praying to them all this time.
Didn't that happen?
and he's been praying to these other gods all this time, and nothing ever happens.
Right.
Right? No answer. and all of a sudden he comes to the temple. Now you understand why Solomon says, God, you hear him in heaven, and you answer his prayer. Right? So, why? So that he will know that you are the one true God, the God that he can pray to, the God that actually does answer prayer, right?
Well, he even expands that to the whole world, the whole people of the world.
Exactly.
Like for the sake of recognizing that.
Exactly. And so eventually he wants everybody to come to fear Hashem just as the people of Israel fear Hashem. If we look at the prohibition against blasphemy, for example, which means that we shouldn't talk bad about the Creator,
then what do we do in opposite?
We sanctify the name. Right? What does it mean to sanctify the name? It means, well, number one, we just don't talk bad about Him. But if we sanctify the name, it means we actually talk well about Him, good about Him. And we want to tell people, in deference and difference to some people, that the God of what people call the Old Testament is a loving, kind God. I think people have this idea that He's this mean, vindictive God, that He's telling people to go kill these people and do this and do that, Don't get me wrong, I can't explain the ways of God and God's justice system. That's Him. That's left up to Him. It's not left up to me. But I can tell you that God of the Torah, the God of the Torah, is a God of compassion. a God of love and a God of mercy. And for us to ever think that He's anything else, we have truly blasphemed the name of God. But in our sense of violating that word, by the way, is we should sanctify His name. Constantly we should be talking about Him. We should be proclaiming His name in all of its goodness and kindness and justice. But understand that all those things that we're talking about are one and the same within Him. They're not broken up into segments. So if I say that God is love, for example, it tends to limit Him to that's all He is. But He's much, much more than that.
Well, it's a representation that He's the source
of love.
Of love.
Right.
Everything, He's the source for everything that we know of. Without Him, there would not be anything else.
Right. For example, wouldn't even be able to define what love is without Him telling us what love is all about. Mm-hmm. So that's the other part. The other part is, if we're looking toward being really virtuous, then don't blaspheme His name. In fact, sanctify His name in every way that you can. And there's many, many ways. I mean, there's a whole lifetime of study of just learning ways to sanctify His name. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, we could come to the prohibition against murder, mm-hmm. right? Well, what's the opposite of that? Mm-hmm. The opposite of that is that we should be trying, to the best of our God-given ability, to preserve life. And let me point out, not just human life, mm-hmm. but life in general. I always remember this great story was told about this rabbi and his son was walking one day on the Sabbath. And as they walked, maybe it wasn't on the Sabbath, but they were walking along and they were having this conversation. And the son just kind of nonchalantly reaches up and plucks a leaf off of a tree. And his father stops and gives him a little reprimand, but explains to him that tree, that leaf, is a living thing. And for his son, just arbitrarily, without thinking about it, to reach up and to pluck that leaf off of that tree was like taking a life in some sense. Now, if you really think about it in a long-term sense, what does that leaf do? That leaf is a living thing.
And it's part of the ecosystem.
And it's part of the system. The system is that this leaf breathes in carbon dioxide. And what does it breathe out?
Oxygen.
It breathes out oxygen. What do we breathe in? Oxygen. What do we breathe out? Carbon dioxide. So in some sense, we're connected to that leaf in a very unique way. Mm-hmm. Well, what if people just carelessly plucked every leaf in the world away? Or look at what's going on, with the destruction of the rainforest in different parts of the world, mm-hmm. Which, number one, is doing away with all kinds of unique plants and unique animals, mm-hmm. That might have all kinds of cures, by the way, because most of the cures for human beings actually come from plants or animals. From nature itself. At the same time, but it's wiping out how much oxygen these plants put back into the system that's breathing in all this carbon dioxide that we're putting out into the world.
It actually seems to be designed in a give and take format.
Yes.
So everything that we take, we are supposed to replenish.
Exactly. So, if
otherwise Adam wouldn't have been given the order to make sure that he,
keeps the garden.
Keeps the garden,
exactly.
And all that stuff.
You got to keep the garden. It's the same, by the way, keeping the garden is the same ecological word that's in Hebrew to ecologize, to ecologize the world or the earth. Mm-hmm. But that's part of our job too, is to preserve life as best we can. Now, a lot of people brings up certain issues. What could I do this and could I do this? You have to look at it as, okay, if that thing has life, and it does, then where does my life intrude into that thing's life?